Hi, and welcome to our latest fantasy chat. Today, I'm delighted to have Lucy A. McLaren. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for coming. And Lucy, from your website, it says you're a writer of fantasy stories and you're drawn to the magic of storytelling, whether it's through books, video games, TV, or films. You're currently working on a really cool sounding fantasy trilogy called The Commune's Curse, published by Santa Fe Writers Project. And your first book, Awakening, is available now. So that's really cool. And I'll read a bit about the book if you're cool with that.
Absolutely.
Awakening, the Commune's Curse. The kingdom of Septima is ruled in all but name by the Commune, a ruthless cult that seeks control of an ancient power that has taken root in unsuspecting children in Septima. To maintain their hold on the kingdom, the Commune will stop at nothing to capture children who show signs of this power to be weaponized or eliminated. 18-year-old Evelyn Folksman is in hiding. Taken in by a tavern owner, she's haunted by the horrific events that drove her from her home years before. Evelyn is forced to face her past when two wayward children, Rafe and Rose Huntsman, arrive at the tavern, pursued by commune soldiers. The children fall under Evelyn's reluctant care as the trio narrowly escape a raid. Relentlessly hunted by Commander Jonas Suleiman and commune agent Lord Eric Tarrant, Evelyn and Rafe cannot fathom why they pose such a threat to the commune until 6-year-old Rose unwittingly reveals a terrible secret. She possesses powers more fearsome than any of the commune has unearthed in decades. There are only two options: to be captured and imprisoned, or to run for the rest of their lives. Woo! So that sounds pretty great. So let's just hop into it. Like, how did you know you wanted to write fantasy?
I've been like reading, playing, watching fantasy for years now. So I remember, I think a lot of it coming together, like the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out when I was like 10, 11. I started reading like Tamora Pierce's Song of the Lioness Quartet was a big one for me, like The Hobbit, Garth Nix, other authors whose names have escaped my mind right now, but all this kind of stuff happened at the same time. I was playing like Legend of Zelda on Nintendo 64. And so all these fantasy things, it just happened at the right time. I don't know, it's something about it, about fantasy. Yeah, like I said on my bio, like the magic of storytelling. And for me, what makes it compelling, I think most of all, is characters. And everything that I find myself drawn to has those strong characters, those interesting characters. Yeah, so I don't know. I find it weird people that don't like fantasy. I'll be honest. Like, it's for me, it's always been there. It's always, because even before like Lord of the Rings and stuff, I remember reading like Enid Blyton and things like that when I was very young. There's always been something about fantasy. So when I came to start writing, because I always wanted to write. I remember when I was a teenager writing in the school library, then stopped for a big period of time because, you know, like anxiety and self-doubt are a thing.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not going to do this. And then when I was in my late 20s, I started training to be a counsellor, had my own therapy, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to do something like for me that actually is a personal interest that's been buried for a long time. And I kind of remember setting myself a goal in 2018. I was like, I'm going to write a book, and I did. It was never going to be anything other than that. Yeah.
That's great. So who would you say in terms of fantasy and books? You mentioned several titles there, and like of fantasy writers and like book writers, who would you say? You mentioned Garth Nix, you mentioned Tolkien. Who are some other big favorites of yours that have powerfully influenced your work?
Definitely Robin Hobb. Like, I think her characters are
Yeah.
amazing. Philip Pullman, his Dark
Yes.
Material is my favorite series of all time. Like, just I've read it so many times, and you know, I first read it when I was young. It's one of those series you can always go back to. I don't know, and I just
It
the
is.
older I get from it, it's amazing. So definitely took a lot of influence from hit that in terms of, like, you know, the demons in that trilogy. I've got animal companions in mind, kind of paying a bit of an homage to that trilogy. But yeah, like Joe Abercrombie is another big one. It's very much any fantasy author that is character focused. And I'm in a kind of process at the moment where I'm trying to discover more authors, because I realized when I started having to do the comp titles for my book before it came out last year, I was like, I feel like I actually very narrow in terms of what I've read, and it's kind of a lot of big names. So I'm trying to look more into, like, mid-tier or lower authors, like people that aren't just like those all the famous ones that
Huge
everyone
name.
knows.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's so much great talent out there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so actually, as much as I don't like social media, it's a bit of
Mm.
a mental health issue and a drain and all that kind of stuff. It does help to meet other authors who write in the same genre, and to find fantastic books. And I know you've got a fantasy book on submission that I'm like, it sounds amazing, so I'm like waiting for it to get picked up and published. Read it.
Please. I know. Like, me too. I don't know, but that's just like the tip of the iceberg of what I have planned. But I love that you made that conscious decision and you just went for it. And I agree with you that networking on social media is a drain, but without it, I wouldn't have found so many wonderful writers and new voices. And I love that we all have that sort of ability to lift each other up,
Mm.
and get those voices out there. That's one reason I do these chats, is because I love making the connection. Like, and I want to know genuinely, like, how did you make these worlds, and related to that, how much of your background do you think has woven itself into your writing, whether it be at work or where you're from?
I think it's definitely had an impact. Like, in terms of this current trilogy, the Commune's Curse, I've tried to put a lot of and I think it's my way of processing, like, a lot of real life stuff. So there's like, as much as it's not, like, I wouldn't call it a political fantasy, but there's a lot of background politics going on, and a lot of stuff that was influenced by things I was seeing in my own country. So Brexit, the whole Windrush. Am I allowed to swear? Like,
Oh, please, whatever you want to do. Yeah.
the Windrush shit show. People, being given like saying this is your country, you can live here, and then suddenly being told decades later that you have to leave the country that's been your home for most of your life. It's just all that kind of bollocks from the government, and on a wider scale, the worldwide kind of political fires that have just been raging. Yeah, so all that kind of stuff has influenced me, and then because I'm a counsellor, I'm very interested in psychology, childhood experiences, childhood trauma, and how that influences people as they grow up, what their behaviours might look like, how they might relate to other people, how their trauma might manifest. All that kind of stuff plays a role, and I'm fascinated by all that kind of psychological aspect of characters, and I think those characters, the ones that are clearly struggling, that have got mental health issues, that have been through trauma. My book also explores stuff like victim blaming, and I know this has become, unfortunately, a bit of a trope in fantasy, like sexual assault and rape as a trope, but it's used in my story as a way of exploring the victim blaming mentality that is in our own society, because that's something that really, it's shocking that it still happens, but it does, and you see it way too regularly. It's just, I think, an issue that, I don't know, people, me personally, I guess it's my way of trying to process it, I think, and trying to understand why people have that kind of way of thinking. So all these kinds of things are explored. So it's definitely, yeah, what I've seen in my life, the experiences that I've had, and experiences that I've heard from, like, my counselling clients, alongside counselling theory, have all kind of played a part in writing this book. And then I think as writers, we can't help but put a little bit of ourselves in our characters.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's possible to write a character and not have it at least be partially you. And so there's 4 main characters in this book, and each of them probably has, to a greater or lesser extent, something of myself in. Evelyn, who is I would argue the main character, we see her perspective the most, probably is the one I can relate to the most. You know, she has a lot of anxiety, depression. She struggles with the past trauma. She has a lot of self-doubt, and you kind of hear a lot of her or read a lot of her inner dialogue and the way she berates herself. So I can certainly relate to her the most, I would say.
I think that grounds the fantasy world so well, you know, for world building, because, you know, in a lot of the, you know, I'll say Lord of the Rings is an example of just being, you don't really dig into how trauma affects their past or whatever they're shaped, you know, and, you know, of course, Tolkien was shaped by war and loss from war and things like that. But I like how modern fantasy really digs into like what makes you a human or a fantasy, you know, whatever you are in your universe, what makes you that full and complete person. So I find it really interesting when fantasy characters are allowed to breathe that way and allowed to be angry and grieve and recognize their hurt and work through it. You know, I think that that resonates a lot with us. I think it's healthy to be able to recognize that in fantasy characters. So I applaud that a lot. I think that's really cool. So this is a planned trilogy, yes? All
Yeah.
right, great. And so when you were planning this trilogy, did you always want it to be a trilogy, or did you start out with kind of a standalone and decide, oh, there's more to this universe? How did that come to be?
I don't remember ever having a conscious plan about it. I started writing it, and the first, I just knew it wasn't going to be a standalone as I was writing the first book. And I don't, whether it's just because my favorite series is a trilogy, I don't know what that was, but I was just like, yeah, this is just going to be a trilogy.
Yeah.
And so I'm a pantser rather than a planner. I get bored planning like stories out. I'm just like, I just want to write and just see what happens. So it was interesting when it came to signing with my publisher, and they were like, oh, have you got like a 3-book plan? And I was like,
And then you suddenly have to be like, oh, I guess I have to make something up real quick.
literally, I was like, oh crap, I need to write a synopsis for like books 2 and 3. So I did, and to be honest, that does help having that, because I always knew where it was going vaguely in my head.
Sure.
But actually, I do see the value in having more of a plan, especially when you're writing a series. Like, I guess because it's different to writing a standalone where you can pants it and then just you don't have to think about future books, but it's very useful to now have that. So I'm glad they did kind of prompt me to write that. And yeah, I don't know, it just kind of naturally became a trilogy, which I'm quite excited about. You know, like book 1 is obviously out now. Book 2 is mostly written. I'm kind of working on a lot of extra scenes that keep popping into my head, because I seem to be an underwriter, because the first book, for example, I think ended up being like 95,000 to 100 words when it was first finished, and then by the time I'd finished it with my editor, it was 120,000. So I was adding in scenes, and so I think I'm at that place now where I'm trying to bump up some extra scenes. You know, where you just kind of like, you're like driving or in the shower or asleep, and there's something like a scene in your head.
Yep. Very familiar. You just race to get it down, right? So
yeah, keeps happening. It's always the most inconvenient times.
always.
I don't know what that is. Our brains are just strange, but it's fun having all these random ideas pop in, and it's also fun writing a book where people are going to come in already knowing obviously the characters and stuff. So it's different writing the second book and carrying on the story, and not, obviously the first one is like setting all the backstory and trying to balance telling people about the world without info dumping and all that stuff, whereas now it's more about the relationships that are developing and how people are changing. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it.
That's great. So related to that world building, when you came up with this world, and what were some of the parts of it that you felt were just so essential, and how did you sort of shape it from that? Like, if you had to pick like a core, let's say 3 things that you think were essential to building this world, what would they be? And
so I think what became very apparent early on was like animal companions were going to be a thing. So those are linked into the magic powers that some people have. And then, like, when I started writing about the powers, I didn't know where they'd come from, but it kind of, as I wrote it, I became aware of a religious aspect that's not set. It's not in the main kingdom of Septima. It's from a separate kind of culture called the Nomarans. They live. They're from the Noman Islands, but the powers come from their gods, and kind of like, you know, thousands of years ago. And as time has gone on, and you know, with what's the word? My brain's just gone. People moving around the world. What is that word for that? Immigration. One of them.
Yeah. Migration, immigration. Yeah.
Yes, there we go. So people moving around, and naturally, you know, the powers have spread amongst all sorts of people around across the world. And so we're focusing on Septima, but the powers didn't originate from there. So I think the powers are the main thing, and then things like the animal companions are linked to people because of the powers that they have. And the religious aspect is not so much explored in book 1, but it is going to be explored in books 2 and 3 more, because I find religion very interesting, and I think I probably blame his Dark Materials for that.
Oh yeah, I could see that. Yeah,
in exploring the impact of religion and its influence on people, and the good and bad side, I guess, to it. So yeah, I'd say those are probably the things.
cool. Yeah.
There was another part to your question. Sorry, what was the second part?
Well,
like how the,
you know, when you're building that world, and so you have those core elements, like how do you frame out? Well, I guess it's sort of related just to world building in general. Like, you know, you mentioned sort of like current events and things that are going on, but what else has shaped those themes? Like, is there something in your environment or special to where you grew up that influenced the world building of those core themes?
That's a good question. I think probably just to do with the stories that I've consumed. And so, you know, I wouldn't say there's anything especially special about my setting. It is a medieval, like, fantasy kind of typical setting in that regard, which, to be honest, I enjoy reading. So I was just like, you know,
right,
I'm gonna
write what you love, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I think probably the commune coming into it being basically an authoritarian government, that, like I said earlier, like the political influences from our world, I think that has a big part in shaping the world as we see it. Like the kingdom of Septima, how people are treated, how the fact that the nobles are very much kind of under the sway of the commune and don't really care what they're doing,
right?
You know, and the fact that they're actively hunting down children and effectively imprisoning them. There's people that are essentially of the mindset of like, it's not affecting me, so whatever, which we do see.
Troubling. Yeah.
So I think that's probably where the strongest influences come in, and how that, because it does very much shape the kingdom.
Fascinating. So this is very immersive from a point of view of, you know, really getting into characters' minds. I love it. That sounds really cool. And so what would you say is sort of the sub genre of fantasy for your book? Is it high fantasy, or is it, you know, grimdark, or somewhere? Is it something?
Yeah,
what do you call your books?
I'd say dark fantasy, because it's not grimdark. It's not that that, you know, it's not Joe Abercrombie levels of kind of brutality.
Yeah.
But we see some, like, some of the darker sides of humanity, I would say. You know, there's we see the way the commune treats people who are traitors. So there's a bit where Evelyn, Rafe, and Rose kind of stumble across a public hanging that's happening as they and as they enter the main city that they're traveling to, they see kind of bodies hanging outside the wall as, like, you know, warnings and stuff. So yeah, there's certainly darker things, but I think there's more of a glimmer of hope in it. In, you know, there's like found family, and there are more positives to it. It's not just dark. Saying that, I'm someone that's a bit of a sucker for like an unhappy ending. Like, I don't like things being tied off with a bow and just like, yeah, they just skipped off into the sunset. So it's very much exploring some difficult things as well. Like, there's like a toxic relationship, like the romance in it is between Commander Jonah Suleiman and Eric Torrent, who's his kind of commanding off lord, but there's like tumultuous backstory there. They've had a romance on and off, but it's very toxic, and I wanted to see that play out realistically rather than, I think there's something currently going on where there's a lot of toxic relationships that are like framed as being romantic, and
Yeah.
it's so, because if you love each other, it's fine if you're treated abusively and that kind of stuff, which is troubling to me. So I wanted to explore that. Actually, this is what a toxic relationship looks like, and this is how it's going to play out. It's not going to be good.
Yeah, I'm glad you're addressing that, because I do feel like that's kind of in some books, you never know, like, what's the perspective here? Are you trying to glorify this as being something aspirational? But I like your approach, because that sounds like something that we could all use, you know, that you have an idea of, this is really actually not okay. Don't do this, you know, respect yourself, you know, and other people better, right? So I find that really fascinating. That's really cool. So switching gears a bit, you know, in your system of magic in your world, you know, what's your favorite, like, if you could have any of the powers in the world, what would you love to have in the real world if you could carry it out?
Ooh, I always think, I'm torn here. Like, I always think being able to like freeze time will be useful, because there never seems to be enough hours in a day.
Especially as a parent. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But also like instant teleportation.
Ooh,
Feel like
yeah.
we, you know, could do a lot of traveling without the expense and time taken to get places. I appreciate that more now. Like, I've moved from the southeast of England to the northeast, and it takes us 7 hours each way whenever we want to go back down. So, you know, that stuff like that makes me appreciate that instant travel will be so handy.
Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? I would be doing that right now, as you know.
Yeah.
So what would you say is like your typical writing day? Like, when you're on, what does it look like for you? How does that work for you?
So that's definitely changed a lot since I had my son.
Yeah, I can.
Before like before I had him, I didn't appreciate all the free time I had. I'd write so much. So since I had him, like so he's almost 2. I struggled on and off with like postnatal depression and mental health struggles, which meant that it's been kind of very up and down in the times that I've had since I had him. So basically, I wouldn't say I have a typical writing day at the moment. It's if I get time, so when he's napping or at nursery, I basically sit down. If my brain is like, the stars have to align a little bit. If I've got enough brain energy,
Yeah,
and feel I haven't got the brain fog going on, I could just sit and I could write out like 1,500, 2,000 words.
it's amazing.
But it's some days it's like pulling teeth, and I can barely get out a couple of hundred words. But I've recently discovered word processors as a thing, as like distraction-free writing tools. So
Oh, yes, I saw you
I
post a picture of a device that
yeah,
doesn't have like a big screen. It's just you sit and you write.
yeah, which is bit like amazingly effective.
Hmm.
Just, you know, all you've got is your keyboard and the screen, and you can just type. Whereas I didn't realize how distracting a laptop is, because you know you get things pop up,
Right.
I don't hate it when there's like a little notification symbol, and I'm like, I need to look
Oh,
at that.
I
And
can't deal
then
with that. Yeah,
yeah,
it's over,
so
right? You're like, oh,
exactly, that it just takes you right out. Whereas if you've got something where all you can do is write, I think this is going to be a really effective tool going forward. So
cool.
I'm a bit of an experimentation phase at the moment to see how that goes. But because I'm working on obviously book 2, I'm working on another book, fantasy standalone fantasy story as well. I'm working on short stories, and so I've got so much I want to do, and I really want to get it done. I'm kind of getting frustrated with myself and the fact that I'm not getting stuff done as much as I want to, or as quickly as I want to. But I think it's a little bit a part of accepting that I don't have as much time as I used to, and just coming to terms with that a little bit.
Right.
But yeah, it's, I think today, these days, on a good day, yeah, he would be 1,500 words or so. But those good days are not as often as I would want them to be at the moment.
Well, it is a big adjustment, trying to carve out that time has always been a challenge, as a parent. I get it. So, but that's an impressive amount of words still in all. So kudos, that's great. So I'm just curious, when you began your writing career, who did you feel most supported you in your endeavors? Because I find that that's such an essential thing to getting this done, right? To feeling that you have a reason, you have support. Who would you say has helped you in your life to support you as a writer?
Definitely my husband. Like he's someone, he has zero interest in reading, in books. So he hasn't read my book. He's not interested in any of the books that I read. But in terms of giving me like time and space and encouragement, yeah, he's been amazing.
Right.
And him, and I think, and a friend of mine called Cindy Van Wilder, who I met like pretty much as soon as I joined Twitter back in, I think, 2018. I put out a call for a beta reader, and they responded and were like, "Oh yeah, I'm interested in, your book sounds interesting." And since then, we've been really good friends, and they've given me so much support and encouragement, and just like, I think they would describe themselves as my number one fan and like a cheerleader, which is so lovely. And just, like I said earlier, social media, it's horrible, but like you said, we both said, you meet so many amazing people on there, and Cindy is one of those people that we've formed a very strong friendship, and I've read their writing and given them feedback, and they do the same for me. And it's just having someone like that. As much as my husband is amazing and he's a cheerleader, he doesn't understand, like, if when you're like having writer's block and getting annoyed or
Yeah.
stuck on,
Right.
anything like that, he doesn't appreciate what that's like. So having a writer who I can kind of have a rant to, or is there to kind of pep me up and give feedback and all that kind of stuff, is equally as valuable. So I'd say probably between my husband and Cindy, they've both really helped me.
That's great. I think you've hit it on the head there, that having a supportive writing community is just priceless. And with other writers, you have that understanding and of all that you go through in your writing, and it's just invaluable. So I'm so glad you have that. So you mentioned writing short fiction, something I also love to do in addition to long form. So what would you say with short fiction, and you're building a world for that small universe? Like, what's your approach to that? How do you write short stories?
Yeah,
How do you build that world, that tiny world?
is, what, I think it's something I'm still trying to understand or do effectively. So there's a few short stories on my website that I just kind of put on there for fun, but I've started writing stories that I want to submit to places now. I had one published actually in January this year, an anthology called Reign of Fire came out from Dragon Soul Press, and that was it was a dragon themed anthology. So it's a short story featuring a dragon, but the main focus is actually the characters in it. The dragon is kind of a side character, and I think that's, again, as much as my longer stories, short stories as well, I'm coming into it from the characters first and foremost. I'm working on one at the moment where it's looking at the main character is a gambling addict, and he's a noble, and he's got like past trauma, like troubled relationship with his father and all this kind of stuff, but he kind of meets a beggar, like a young woman on the streets, and it's like, as the story progresses, they kind of talk, and he actually finds someone that is listening to him for the first time. And it's looking at how human connection can help process trauma and like addiction and stuff, because I've got experience of that in my own life on a personal and professional level. And so that, as much as I describe it as fantasy, the only thing that's fantasy about it is that it's set in a made up like city, which is kind of, I'll probably describe it as like Victorian London-esque, maybe, like that kind of setting. But I wouldn't say it's like heavily fantastical. So I don't know whether that counts as even fantasy. I don't know. But it's, for me, I would just come at it from like the characters and so I don't know if maybe I don't world build enough. But I just try and keep it to, I guess, what's relevant to the story. And when it's a short story like that and it's focusing on characters, I don't need to bring a huge amount of world building into it. And I guess it's the type of story you want to tell and how much that world influences what the characters are going through. And when it's very kind of close for that book, for that story in particular, there's like the two main characters and then like a couple of side ones, but it's all set in like a study. Yeah, I'm thinking about this now. I'm like, how much do I actually world build? And I don't know that I do a huge amount.
Well, I mean, I think like you're writing, you're emphasizing those characters first and foremost and putting them in an extraordinary setting, and therefore it is fantasy. So that's really it at the end of the day, and I always think that like it doesn't matter how fancy this world is if the characters don't still seem real. That's just all, it's like a painting, but this is a story, right? So sounds like you've got a pretty immersive world, whether or not you're really realizing it. You don't have to name drop a bunch of things, to make it fantastical. It already is. So kudos to you for that too. Now, if you were if you had a dream project, let's set aside the trilogy because that's already a dream project. That's marvelous. But what would your dream fantasy project be?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, probably the other one that I'm working on at the moment, which is that standalone fantasy, and it's been like on the back burner in my brain for quite a long time, like since before I had my son. And I call it like my serial killer fantasy, and it's so I can't remember what it's called now. There's a book about the 5 victims of Jack the Ripper.
Ooh.
Might even be called The Five. But basically, yeah, so focusing on who they were as people rather than the fact that people focus on Jack the Ripper, right? And who he was. Like, actually, who did he kill? Because that's probably more important, who they were as people.
Yeah.
But I read that, I had this idea in my head of like, yeah, kind of Jack the Ripper influence. So it's another one that's like a fantasy, probably like a city on the brink of like industrial revolution and that kind of stuff. So not medieval as would be typical. And so looking at the impact of a serial killer on a city, we meet a young woman whose father is murdered by him, and she kind of ends up teaming up with another young woman, a noble. So I like looking at the difference in classes apparently, because that's coming up again in another story. So this one is one that I think I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's one that I really want to finish. Like, but
sounds really cool.
Yeah, so it's like, murder mystery, but there's also looking at like patriarchal issues and breaking down or fighting against the patriarchy. And there's also a heavy religious kind of influence as well on this one, and looking at the impact that has on people and the oppression of it versus the way it kind of, what's the word? I'm sorry, my brain. Oppression versus what is like lifting people up? Seriously, baby brain doesn't. Inspiration, thank you. Oh my god. Right, so the way it oppresses some people and inspires others, and how, depending on where you are and who, the way that religion can impact on you. So that's one that I think is, at the moment, is so much like in my head. That's probably what I would call my dream project. Like the idea of finishing that feels like very far away right now, but I really look forward to that day that I finish that first draft.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Is this something where you could write a little bit on it while you're working on, the rest of your trilogy, like sort of on the margins? Because sometimes I do that. I'm wondering if you ever do that a little bit, like kind of take a break from one and write a little bit on the other.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got like a chunk of it written that I've kind of worked on, dipped into every now and then, because I find, and I don't know if this is the reason why you jump around as well. Sometimes you just need a break right from
Yeah,
that one project because your brain just hits a wall with it, and so going away and looking at something else, weirdly refreshing, isn't it, when you go back to that
it is.
first one?
Well, it's kind of like I like to cook, and I like to bake, but I get really burned out on it. And then I'm like,
Mm.
I can't be bothered. I can't cook. I need to like go to a restaurant or get a takeout or something and take a break. But if you have that for a few days, like if you're on a trip or something, you get back, I'm like, oh my God, I've got to cook now. I can't handle this anymore. So it's kind of that sort of in ecology, we sort of call it prey switching behavior, in which like, an animal will given like a lot of its favorite prey, it will just gorge on that. But then it's like, I'm done. I need a break, and it switches. So that's prey switching behavior. I do that with snacks. But anyway, it's just kind of the same with words though. It's like you're kind of done. You're like, I can't do that right now. I need to go over here, or hitting a wall, whatever it is, or you're just kind of sick of it, right? Like you need like to open the windows of your mind and let the fresh air in, and then, oh, I'm getting chilly. I'm going to shut it now and get back to it. So
Yeah, that's a good way
yeah,
of putting it. Yeah, it does something to refresh your brain, and you go back in with fresh eyes, and suddenly you can carry on writing it, and it feels, yeah, it just feels very beneficial having a break. And I
yeah,
find it struggling on a particular story, then yeah, going away from it for a while definitely helps. I mean, it kind of helps that like book two is like 90% done, so I
amazing.
feel a bit more about that, so I can dip into other stuff. But yeah, I can't imagine just having one thing to work on. I think it would quickly become not boring, but just, I don't know, your creative brain doesn't get all the workout it needs from just one project. And I think it having multiple different things, because sometimes you get ideas that are just so random that don't fit into
Totally.
anything that you
Yeah.
right, and I've got to put that. I'm gonna write that down. Put that over
Yep.
there for now.
Yep. That's what I do. I have like this huge running Excel spreadsheet. Or if I'm out like at school pickup, like I put it on my notes app on my phone or whatever, And so I think that's really good advice. But I want to know though, what's the worst writing advice you ever received?
Oh, I think it's probably the idea that like you shouldn't be open to criticism. And I remember seeing some of this like discourse. Again, this is like the negative side of social media. Any kind of discourse around anything where people are like, "Don't do this," or "This is like a hard and fast rule." I think criticism, as much as it can be very jarring to receive, or a bit like, "Oh, like that's a personal slight against me." Actually, some of the most useful feedback I've had has been like critical in some way. Um, I think it's the only way I've been actually able to develop as a writer is to be open to that kind of stuff. Because yeah, if you don't let other people see your work for fear of criticism, it's not going to develop in any
Right.
way. Like when I look at draft one of Awakening compared to the book that it was when it released, just worlds apart. Like it's so
Right.
much development. That's multiple. There's beta readers. There's editors. There's me going back in and being like, "What the hell is this? Like, I need to change this." Just you know, sometimes you look at something, you're like, "Did I write that? Like, what the hell is this pile
Well,
of crap?" Or,
thinking. Yeah.
yeah, or it could be the other way, like, "Wow, I wrote this."
Oh, I know, which is
But
always fun. Yeah. But
that's always a good feeling. But yeah, ultimately, I think the idea of people who are kind of a bit guarded about letting their work out into the world because of fear of criticism, I'd say criticism is helpful. Like ultimately, you don't need to take on board everything that someone gives you as feedback. Like if you don't agree
yeah.
with it and they're trying to change your story too much, then
Right.
you know, don't do that. But equally, there's going to be valuable insights from other people that you just don't see yourself. You're too close to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just like, typos always happen too magically after
Oh my.
you've turned it in, after you've turned it into your editor, after your editor has worked on it, after you and your editor fixed it, after it's gone to proof, after it's published, there's always more typos. So
Yep.
forgive yourself, have
Mm.
to give yourself grace, because they're like a little demon that pops into everything. But yeah, that
Mm.
criticism, I feel like you've spoken really eloquently about that. And I feel too, it's kind of like a fledgling bird. You're going to
Mm.
stumble a bit, and that's the only way you're going to fly, right? You have to get out of that nest and get it out in the world. Our books are birds, right? They need to fly. So criticism is not, it can hurt sometimes if we let it, but that's a power we don't have to give it. We could take
Mm.
the beneficial energy out of that and use it to make our work better. And that's what editors are for. Thank God for editors, right? So literally making everything better, for us. I mean, and like you said, though, it's important that if you feel strongly and there's something you don't want to change, then, you know,
Yep.
say that, do that, act on it. So very good advice. And so someone starting out writing, what would be your best advice for them?
I'd say like don't get caught up in overthinking like scenes or like even the first chapter. I see a lot of people asking about how do you get past the first chapter because they like will be so like going back and editing it and like trying to make it perfect.
Oh yeah.
It's like just that's not going to happen, right? Like
No,
first draft is
I don't sweat that one.
absolutely. I think this is something I would have benefited from hearing when I was first writing Awakening because I definitely was editing as I went. Whereas actually there's no point because it's going to ultimately when it goes to an editor and all the multiple other people that will be involved, it's going to get changed then. So just don't waste your time doing that. Just literally write like word vomit onto a Word document.
Yep.
And then
Boom. Get it down. Yep.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. But before we go, I want to know if there's anything I haven't asked that you would like for readers to know. And how can we find you and your books?
Anything you haven't asked? I don't think so. I don't know. Basically, if you like dark fantasy that's got like animal companions and it's got a found family, it's got a chosen one with a twist. If you like tropes, some people do. But also trying to break away from some of the more troubling things that I've personally seen in fantasy or people like what they like, but I think if we can look at realistic mental health representation and hopefully it's something that helps people to process what they've been through or to understand what other people have been through. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, please do check it out. I've got a copy here. Here we go.
It's gorgeous.
Yay! And yeah, so you can add me on social media. The one I'm probably most active on is Instagram. So it's Lucy_A_McLaren. And my website is lucyamclarenauthor.com. And I do send out a kind of regular newsletter where I talk about what I've been doing, like the series and what I'm working on, but I also break down a counselling theory where if you're writing characters, I try and kind of break it down and make it a useful tool for writers to use as like creating character backstory. So
Wonderful.
Understand characters from a psychological perspective. So, if that sounds like a useful tool, please do sign up. It's sent out regularly.
Fantastic. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for being on Fantasy Author Chat. This has been lovely. And I look forward to reading your books and your short stories.
Thanks, Dianne.
Thank you.